Okay. Welcome everyone on behalf of Rodemos el Diálogo to this Embrace Dialogue Academia Seminar number 8. We are delighted to have you here today. We are delighted to have Diego, who I'm not going to introduce because Gwen will do that when she starts the chairing, and we are delighted to have Julia Paulson, a close friend of Rodemos el Diálogo, in the last seminar in this series with Merton College. This is such an important topic today that we are discussing, and in particular, it's so good to have Diego from Cali. As you all know, Colombia is going through a complex moment, and we believe that these spaces are an example of how we can all contribute to peace building in Colombia. Embrace Dialogue is an organization that has been working for the last 8 years supporting peace building in Colombia and is now trying to share the knowledge we have acquired with other countries around the world. And we organize different series of events. We have different teams. Some teams work on transitional justice, other teams work on pedagogy, other teams work on negotiations with the ELN and reincorporation of the FARC. And we have a team of academics who's also trying to build bridges with practitioners. In all of our spaces and in the work that we do, we try to use 6 principles of the culture of dialogue, and we suggest these principles as the blueprint for the spaces that we organize. So we invite you to try to embrace these principles today in this academic seminar that is being live streamed, and Gwen will explain all the logistics about it. So the 6 principles that I want to share with you before handing over to Gwen are the following. We deeply believe in co-responsibility, so we hope you come to this space to build with academics, practitioners, and students and policymakers ways of making or building a better world. We also deeply believe in generosity, so we hope you come into this space to give the best of yourselves, to try to offer ideas and thoughts so that we can all build this world better. We also believe deeply in self-criticism. So we hope that you come to this space with some humbleness to try to reassess your prejudices and understand your own limitations. And with that, being able to live with new ideas in your mind. We also deeply believe in solidarity. So we hope that in this space, you can understand the hardship of others and offer your hands to help in any way you can. Finally, we believe in respect and honesty. So we hope that you come to this space with a deep respect for the ideas of other people and with the heart open to share what you believe in this space that is a space of trust, to try to honor the idea that peace is something that we build every day. So without further ado, I hand over to Gwen, and I thank her a lot for hosting this seminar series on behalf of Rodemos el Diálogo. It's been a great pleasure, and we have learned a lot over the last 8 seminars, and really looking forward to this today.
Thank you very much, Andre, and welcome also on behalf of Merton College. This is a really important seminar. I couldn't imagine a better way to end the series than with Diego Nieto, who is a researcher at the Instituto de Estudios Interculturales in the Universidad Javeriana in Cali, and has recently obtained his PhD in Comparative International and Development Education from the University of Toronto, where he was examined by Dr. Julia Paulson, who's here with us today as discussant, who is Associate Professor in Education, Peace and Conflict from the School of Education at the University of Bristol. And this seminar series, Embrace Dialogue Academia Seminars, has been one of the ways in which at Rodemos el Diálogo Academia team, we have tried to build bridges between recent academic research on Colombia and peace building issues and policy making and peace building challenges in practice. And so this has been a series of seminars where we've tried to build bridges and ask really what can recent finished research on Colombia from different disciplines and from scholars of different generations help us see about what we can learn about what we need to do to support peace building challenges in Colombia today. And as Andre mentioned, it's particularly a pleasure to be able to have Diego here speaking from Cali, which is the epicenter, or anyway, one of the main epicenters of the current strike in Colombia. And the role of youth has, of course, as I'm sure many of you will know, been important in the strikes. So we are in a very important dialogue today, and Julia has the very enviable task of answering the question, what are the policy challenges resulting from this research for Colombia today? I think there's going to be a very, very rich discussion, and after hearing Diego's presentation, we will be able to also talk a little bit about how this can help us see the current situation in Colombia, the current crisis, and of course, an expression of solidarity from Merton College and Rolemos de Diálogo before we start to all of the people who are affected by the violence currently in Colombia. And I'm extremely grateful for Diego for making the time in the midst of all of what's going on to come and share his research with us today. The way that we're going to do this is, first of all, Diego will present his PhD thesis, which we hope to see published as a book in the near future. And he will speak for about 30 minutes with the presentation, and then Julia will have 10 minutes to comment and look a bit about what the implications for current policy challenges are from this research. And then we will open out to a Q&A with all of you. So please do be ready to interact with our fantastic panelists. We do encourage you to turn your mics on when you are going to ask a question, if you would like to, rather than just typing it into the chat. This is a space of where we encourage dialogue, as Andre emphasized. But if you don't feel comfortable doing it, or you don't feel comfortable being recorded, because this seminar is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube, and we'll share the link in the chat in a moment, in case you'd like to share it with your contacts. If you don't feel comfortable being recorded, then perhaps just write in the chat your question, or write to me directly privately if you prefer, and we'll read the question out. I think without further ado, I will just again thank both Julia and Diego so much for coming today and making the time at the end of a busy term for this very important discussion. And thank you all for coming. And I will hand over now to Diego. Over to you. You're on mute.
Many thanks. 1 year after, and you're still making some mistakes. So I'm just going to share the presentation first. And I wanted to start by saying that I'm not used to reading, but I'm going to be reading today because I've not presented that much in English lately, I think after the defense. So apologies for that. And first of all, I want to thank Wen for inviting me to speak at the RED seminar and for organizing, and to Julia Paulson for having agreed to participate in my PhD committee as an external, but most of all for devoting time and effort to engage with my doctoral thesis and for her great feedback and advice since. Secondly, I wanted to say that my intention is to present part of my PhD research entitled Learning Conflict in the Midst of Violence, Urban Youth and School Life in Colombia Post-Conflict Transition. But I'm also hoping we can make this an opportunity to raise awareness and create an environment in which we can reflect on the very serious events we've been through in the last few weeks here in Cali, events that have had young people at the center of mobilizations, but as targets of repression of a level that I have personally never witnessed in a urban center, at least since I have any kind of political awareness. Lastly, I want to say that I'm hoping to turn this work into a book in the forthcoming future, so I'm very much looking forward to hearing your feedback, which I'm sure will help me improve these insights. So this research journey began in late 2016 when I returned to Colombia to conduct my research. As a Colombian citizen, I also came back to participate in the plebiscite that was supposed to provide popular support for the peace agreement reached between the FARC guerrilla and the Colombian state. My intention was to study the deployment of peace pedagogies in the path towards peace building that the agreement was intended to open up. However, the plebiscite results abruptly changed both the political context of the peace process and my own research. As many of you may know, rejected by a very small margin, the plebiscite revealed a country divided on the issue of peace across different cleavages, and for some political commentators, geographic lines constituted one of the most important. Peripheral regions, more directly affected by armed conflict violence, voted in favor, and central regions less directly affected by the conflict harbored the majority of the opposition to peace. This redirected my approach and methodology and led me to explore a different set of questions. First, what was the role of peace education deployed in the midst of aspiration and controversial narratives of post-conflict and within the persistence of inherited, recycled, and new forms of violence? In what ways youth made sense of this context in two urban schools located in different geographies of violence and peace? And also wanted to know what were the interaction between these two instances, youth experiences and conceptions of this context, and the educational efforts aimed at peace building. To answer these questions, I designed a study comparing contrasting school locations in terms of their proximity to armed conflict violence. As such, my methodology was based on a comparative case study approach that studies pedagogical processes across sites and scales. This approach considers the use of multi-sited ethnography to study schools not as isolated and bounded cases, but rather as part of larger processes, scales, social relations, and networks. These two schools, one in Cali and one in Tumaco, as you see there, share similar characteristics, such as being located in relatively marginalized urban neighborhoods of these places and being low ranked in national tests. For this subnational comparison, I conducted interviews with public officials, stakeholders on peace education, participant observations in schools between 2017 and 18, and individual groups interviews with school staff. Lastly, I also designed focus groups based on elicitive strategies aimed to discuss with young people two things: the local problems affecting youth in their surroundings, their views on controversial topics regarding peace, the peace process, and armed conflict, and their envisioned actions as citizens to address some of these previously identified problems. Today, I would like to address three major themes from my thesis that I think speak to the current context. First, how to understand conflict, violence, and peace in times of transition. What is the role of pedagogy and schooling, and particularly the curriculum, in the midst of violence? And lastly, youth views and concerns on three major themes that emerge in my conversations on convivencia, or peaceful coexistence as is normally translated, citizenship, and peace. So first, about understanding conflict and peace. To study conflict and peace, I started asking about young people's lived experiences and conceptions on conflict and violence. For this, I distinguish conflict from violence. For me, conflict is not inherently destructive, but instead a constitutive force of social relations and institutions. As such, I was interested not only in talking with young people about the direct violence, physical, psychological, verbal, or material affecting them in their lives. More broadly, I wondered about the social conflicts and power relations that were at the roots of both this direct violence and other indirect manifestations of violence they suffered, such as forms of discrimination, exclusion, inequities, and exploitation. Engaging first with the lived experiences of young people was a crucial step that helped me realize the significant place that people's representations of violence had in how they understood conflict, and more significantly, perhaps, how they envisioned its possible transformation. In this exploration, I gradually identified a rupture, both in research participants and the special literature on violence and education, between what I decided to call small and big representations of conflict and peace, or CP. This rupture, I sense, had significant implications for peace education during a post-conflict phase. Small CP concerns were hard to ignore in my study because of their very prominent role within school violence frameworks that have gained relevance in the last decades. In the context of Latin America, these frameworks were epitomized by school convivencia approaches dealing with issues such as bullying, early pregnancy, youth delinquency, and drug consumption within schools. These approaches privilege interpersonal security measures, hoping to create safe schools. Significantly, this rupture that I mentioned disconnects small CP concern and everyday intimate violence from the big CP conflict and peace topics related to large conflict and cleavage. In the cases of places like Colombia, these include the protracted violence characteristic of armed conflict, but also debates on the peace accords, the politics of post-conflict, and processes of societal reconciliation. Pedagogy appeared as the key to study this rupture. It was a construct that helped disclose both the disconnect between small and large representations of conflict and violence, but also, and perhaps more importantly, what these small and big representations were making more or less visible of these social conflicts in the lives of people. For me, pedagogical engagements and encounters, including of course those happening in the school curriculum, constitute the repertoires offering explanations of the social conflicts present in society. Through them, young people make sense and create representations of the conflicts and violence occurring around them. In this way, these pedagogies of conflict and violence inform their citizenship embodiments and performances. This pedagogical engagement helps young people navigate both the small C violence they experience in their everyday lives and the big C narratives of social conflict present in society. The significance of pedagogical efforts lies therefore in their bearing on how people experience and represent conflict from their particular positions in society, which in turn has a bearing on their identities and sense of agency to face those conflicts. Thus, my understanding of youth citizenship identities is not limited to a legal status. It refers to the ways in which young people construct hybrid and multi-layer identities to perform roles in face of the everyday struggles they live, but also in how they embrace and take positions in face of the divisive societal narratives of conflict and peace present in the country. The pedagogical landscape within which my research took place consisted not only of the official curricular mandates. It was made up by the pedagogical discourses and narratives circulated in society, and the power relations involved in how they travel through bureaucracies and reach the lives of young people. What I first called the field of pedagogies of peace was made up by a wide variety of pedagogical initiatives circulating in the country. These dealt with different aspects of the armed conflict and the peace-building process, such as memory work, the peace process itself, and the more recent efforts related to the transitional justice system. Due to the contested character of peace, however, these initiatives have had a very limited capacity to create widely accepted public narratives to explain the patterns, causes, and actors involved in Colombia's conflict. They face difficulties to reach the public imagination and raise awareness about the consequences of war or on the structural reforms and cultural changes needed to move towards peace. The official curriculum, in turn, has somehow distanced itself from these pedagogies of peace. State guidelines that more directly address the topics of conflict and violence are made up of a series of cross-curricular layers relying on general notions of active citizenship, school convivencia, and a culture of peace as present in the Cátedra de Paz curricular requirement. These curricular layers remain fairly abstract, almost as if made for any country, insofar as they generally avoid or narrow down the study of big CP social conflicts and controversial topics related to the Colombian armed conflict. In the absence of a centralized curriculum and enjoying high degrees of curricular and pedagogical autonomy, schools in Colombia often develop their own pedagogical projects and curricular practices to include, or not, these topics. They often do this with the support and intervention of both local and regional local secretariats as well as other actors, such as non-governmental organizations interested in developing peace education projects. This creates an enormous diversity of pedagogical efforts. And this is the reason why public officials and other stakeholders whom I've interviewed often use the metaphor of a Colombian soup, the sancocho, to describe the shape of the curriculum when it finally reached the school. This soup, traditionally made with many ingredients and in particular ways in each region, serves as an image to explain how peace curriculum in Colombian school is the result of a plurality of ways of mixing the ingredients and interpreting the recipes available. Different soups are created for different tastes, depending on who participates in the preparation and the ingredients added. Yet, as these soups are prepared within an unequal system, the results are uneven. Many students receive a small or diluted soup that packs fewer ingredients and where conflict and peace are often left out. There are no conditions in the education system of resources, coordination, and support to ensure that everyone can make a really nourishing sancocho that includes conflict and peace in ways that respond to the liking and needs of their specific context. Well, here are some more examples that we can maybe discuss in depth if we want to, about materials from each of these fields. Okay. Given these conditions of the educational system, it is the individual efforts from specific teachers what really defines the opportunities young people have to engage with the topics of conflict and peace in their schools. I studied these processes in two schools, the Bordering Tumaco Public School and the Central Cali Public School. Tumaco was considered a laboratory of post-conflict because of the levels of armed confrontation and coca crops at the time, while the Barrio Obrero could be defined as a liminal space of the city, located in downtown of the city and bringing together traditional cultural practices of football and salsa dancing with complex dynamics of small drug trade and exclusion. In these schools, I engaged in a total of 14 focus groups, and I also interacted closely with 3 secondary school teachers and 2 school coordinators who were in charge or were interested in citizenship education and convivencia matters within secondary school. I also participated in several curriculum design meetings and planning activities in each school, as well as extracurricular events between 2017 and 2018. Significantly, regardless of their proximity to armed conflict violence, there were some prominent pedagogical and curricular practices shared by both schools in how they dealt with conflict and violence. These practices made more or less visible certain aspects of conflict and violence within different convivencia, citizenship, or peace educational goals. School convivencia practices tend to reduce school violence to a problem of individual behaviors through anti-bullying frameworks that serve as a prism of these conflicts, the symbolic and physical use of school walls that separated the school community from the community, and in classroom management practices that render power imbalances and cultural patterns as irrelevant in the study of the conflict lived in these communities. In school life, citizenship education was widely conceived as the fostering of personal responsibility, with teachers seeking to provide at-risk youth with an envisioned life project of individual social mobility. More commonly, citizenship education manifested in teachers' overwhelming imperative to transmit to students the values of a good citizen. These values reflected middle-class, urban cosmopolitan, racialized moral standards and embodiments of citizenship that were often at odds with the students' cultural backgrounds, causing significant dislocations with these students' sense of belonging towards the school. Lastly, despite being in a country undergoing a peace process and being in places surrounded by violence, peace and big C post-conflict oriented education was largely nullified from the enacted curriculum in both schools. This was a result partly of teachers' fear of addressing certain topics, such as youth recruitment, sexual abuse, or drug small trade within the school because of violent actors who ruled convivencia in the neighborhood. As these issues became taboo subjects, entire school communities learned how to be silent, and that there were things you better not talk about or denounce as an injustice. These absences were, however, covered by other actors, such as the police, who narrowed down these issues through strategies ranging from moralistic and behavioral talks on drug consumption and trade within schools, or the deployment of surveillance mechanisms around these schools. These curricular practices within schools led me to argue that there exist in Colombian society pedagogical mechanisms that invisibilize the structural, cultural, and structural roots of violence. In this way, these pedagogical mechanisms privatize, individualize, and depoliticize the social conflicts underlying different manifestations of violence. In this way, they contribute to the symbolic normalization of intimate and conflict violence, and to a more general concealment of indirect violence. Worldly, the schools are fundamental sites enabling and reinforcing these symbolic processes of normalization. In fact, they operate as a double-edged sword. While providing a space of stability and inclusion for young people, they also normalize the violence that affects them and everyone in their community. Pedagogical practices within schools, therefore, had an important bearing on young people's prominent concerns for convivencia, a small CP-oriented citizenship agency, and peace-building skepticism. So the last thing I wanted to highlight refers to the connections and disconnections of peace pedagogies and the school curriculum with the citizenship identities of young people living in the midst of violence. Similarly to what occurred within the school's curricular practices, it was remarkable that young people's lived experiences, concerns, and conceptions on both places privileged those issues related to intimate violence or small C convivencia, even despite the proximity of Tumaco students to armed conflict violence. For both sets of students, convivencia concerns in the form of everyday episodes of urban crime, intolerance, and domestic violence remain the most visible in their lives. Convivencia meant for most of them desires for safety and order, the impositions of rules of behavior both within the school and outside school. Young people's expressions of citizenship reflected their daily struggles to be someone in life and the search for a sense of belonging. as in their prevalent concerns with drug consumption, when they spoke of dealing with loneliness, the lack of sociocultural ties, and the absence of public spaces for enjoyment. Likewise, they were evident in the civic actions they proposed to address these social issues. They favored campaigns directed at individual behaviors, such as drug use or recycling, and also targeted individuals through measures such as enhancing moral character, providing psychological help, or simply punishing perpetrators. Discussing their views on controversial topics regarding the peace process also made evident the rupture between their small CP convivencia experiences and concerns with the big CP post-conflict debates present in the country. They relied on media narratives, especially television, and their families to determine their positions on these topics, reflecting wider binary views of the armed conflict as existential oppositions between friends and enemies. These views became more nuanced, however, once we engaged more in depth with what the peace reforms implied, including the reintegration of ex-combatants or transitional justice. In that regard, it was significant that in the case of Tumaco students, closest experiences with armed conflict violence seem to provide with greater potential for empathy toward victims and perpetrators of armed conflict violence. This represented an important comparative difference with Cali students that was not seen in the rest of the topics discussed. For instance, in discussions on gender and ethnic rights within the peace process, they tended to hold disembodied and deterritorialized opinions populated by larger, antagonistic narratives or more abstract principles of tolerance and inclusion that took over their experiences on gender, race, and work. So again, here are some examples of each of these topics. In Tumaco, the idea of order and desires for mano dura, a concern with the uses of time and the recruitment by groups of young people who are not spending usefully this time, but also many narratives and inclinations toward peace. And in the case of El Barrio, in this social cartography, the concern with invisible frontiers and the definition of territories within the neighborhood, and the impossibility to use public spaces, especially for women. The very important place of football supporters and barras in the urban territorial life. And lastly, the high and much larger skepticism and distrust toward peace compared to Tumaco students. I think some of these issues are very present in what is happening right now. We can discuss more about it later. To sum up this interaction between youth and schools in the representations of conflict and violence, I use the expression a tale of two violences. Through it, I aim to show how, first of all, although it might sound paradoxical, convivencia concerns became a daily obstacle for people to be able to see the relevance of peace and post-conflict aspirations. The privatization of social conflict and the normalization of violence, leading to the worrying consequence of an acceptance and even desire for the imposition of authoritarian orders of convivencia in everyday life. Secondly, the embodiments of citizenship privileging small c ideals of the good citizen, leaving these young people torn between becoming respectable citizens or disposable bodies, all based on the image of a respectable society that is relieved from its responsibility in the big P social production of conflict. Lastly, the absences of opportunities to learn about big P narrative and explanations on the Colombian conflict as a social process outside families and TV creates enormous gaps between everyday experiences of violence, potentials for empathy, and understandings of the historical and sociocultural roots of conflict that gravely affects beliefs in the effectiveness of large-scale and long-term hopes for peace. So some concluding messages or challenges for the present. First of all, peace and peace education in a million schools still has a lot of trouble to acquire meaning for young people in Cali and Tumaco, and for the navigation of forms of violence and the often limited opportunities to address these topics. So there are certain challenges for pedagogies for peace in this post-conflict peace. Most of all, I said the ways in which we try to disrupt the symbolic normalization of violence. Since pedagogical efforts have great difficulties in reaching the public imagination amid divisions, distrust, and opposing narratives about what happened, a first challenge is to create as many fields of public debate as possible, reaching out and bringing together diverse populations of the ideological spectrum that prepare and accustom the general public to talk openly about both controversial topics and emotionally difficult issues stemming from decades of violence. I think in this it is very important that we distinguish between prevailing narratives in the news and the political country from youths and teachers' everydayness. One thing is what the political country talks about, another the intellectual country in academia, and quite another the narratives to which the popular country makes sense of Colombia's social conflict. Engaging young people in, I say, indirect and direct conflict analysis may help them navigate and be creative to face complex conflicts, such as migrations, environmental crises, health epidemics, the consequences of transnational inequities, protected violence, violent extremism, and the polarization of transitional times. So less about like oppositional parties and more about understanding the complexity of these conflicts. These efforts, however, require creating environments that link two important pedagogical tools developed in Colombia. Historical memory narratives, both subjective and large-scale, that appeal to emotions and empathic connections between antagonists of the conflict, but also the analysis of the roots of conflict and practices of collective transformation that help raise awareness and find common goals about the necessary cultural and structural transformations ahead. A second challenge is to bring these peace pedagogies into schools. The competence and standards approach probably in the country's curricular guidelines could help fostering this practice of collective conflict analysis and transformation, as long as they address more openly the type of contents and activities that would entice these connections. Schools remain instrumental in achieving the ever-difficult goals of scaling up peace pedagogies, reaching out to the historically excluded, and to make these pedagogies sustainable over time. In this, we must consider the double role schools play as offering protection, but also as offering alternative representations of violence to the communities in which they are located. Pedagogical practices that experiment how to unsilence certain topics, how to connect big and small expressions of violence, and how to bridge these contents and skills with the everyday cultural expressions of young people in different places, with different people, and along different conflicts may enhance our understandings and capabilities to address the roots of conflict as a social process. In particular, I like to highlight four ingredients that I consider very important for conflict transformation, and which not only try to stop and prevent direct violence, but also aim to redress four ingredients of peace. Peace as power aims at understanding peace as more than empathy and personal responsibility, situating agency based on an analysis of conflict and power relations that fosters a political imagination for collective transformation. Peace as identity considers the need to address the passions and emotions that inform people's adoption of specific perspectives and sides in a given conflict. Not to do away with them, but to learn to practice non-violent agonistic conflict engagement as an intrinsic aspect of political life. Peace as justice contributes to differentially consider the positions and geographies involved in the structural and cultural injustices that need to be overcome to create peace. Yet, peace as justice also engages with the intergenerational struggle to address the multiple responsibilities to transform systems of violence. This in turn speaks at last of peace with a horizon of reconciliation, calling for pedagogies that help us tackle these issues from a historical perspective, to confront the past and to understand the present as a shared responsibility to imagine a different future. This means not acting as a respectable society that was harmed by criminals from the outside, but as a society that has those issues breathing alive within itself. This horizon of reconciliation is crucial as it creates the intergenerational connections that can lead us towards a common path. And speaking of intergenerational issues, I think just the last challenge, evidently for what is happening right now, here are some examples from which I extract my theoretical pedagogical suggestion and some practices that I've been trying to be involved with incorporating this. We can maybe talk about it. But I think right now what we have is that last intergenerational challenge. These are just some reflections I'm trying to gather together of what is happening right now, and in the Institute I'm working in how to understand this content and these new cycles of violence in urban spaces. If we look at the map of Cali and where the places where this has been happening, what do they represent in the city and the type of exclusion and specialization they mean, I think we start to understand how peace obviously needs to involve both rural but also urban problems, and like that separation and that has cost us a lot to understand what's happening right now. At the same time, if we look at other municipalities of the region, we have like informal jobs of rates of 80% in 2018. So I mean, like in 2021, 3 years later, is probably much more worse in terms of rate. So this kind of, there are ways in which we can interpret this as a problem of like the conditions of youth, but I feel that we also have to incorporate the temporalities of peace as a matter of what is happening right now. So in terms of these narratives of expectations and promises that become hegemonic and orientate the actions of young people, like the promises of peace, the promises of democracy, like the generation I lived in, which was democracy in 1991, and this generation has heard so much about peace, 2016. What happens when these narratives are quickly overturned and aborted, really? And what these expectations mean for these unfulfilled intergenerational promises in the life of young people. So how do we understand this in a moment in which there is the end of the armed conflict, but the emergence of a lot of social conflicts that were like received because of that violence, but that could be recycled. So I feel one of the main worries is it is great that there's this mobilization of young people, but also we are like in this double-edged also sword of what could happen with these young people because of the places they occupy in both these places, like in Cali and the Pacific. So there is a big danger of the persistence of violence, the status quo, because what that could mean for these young people. And one topic that I think is very interesting we could discuss a lot is I hear a lot about in this process of dialogue how people are worried that these young people who are in the points and the blockades, they lack formación política or political education, as they say in the political movement. So unions and other traditional actors in politics, they are worried that they don't know how to deal with this part of young people who are really that been so outside of any kind of political inclusion that they lack this kind of formation politica. But my worry is that while in Cali we see right now this mobilization in the Pacific that is also happening around peace and it's been active, there are many young people who are not there because they are already recruited in these new cycles of violence, because they are already part of what is not happening in Cali thanks to this mobilization that is happening. So I think this is a very important moment to reflect also on these worries and concerns on this, what I call the temporalities of peace. So I just leave it there to start the discussion.
That was absolutely fantastic, Diego. Really, I have so many comments and questions, and it resonates with so much of my own findings during the peace process and shortly after. And I love how you also managed to really neatly at the end draw some very concrete messages about how this helps us see the current challenges today. So brilliant presentation. Julia, over to you. What can you help us see from your expertise in education on how this can help us understand challenges for peace building today in Colombia?
Thanks, Gwen, and thank you, Diego. Just to echo, what a fabulous, rich, and really thought-provoking presentation, as always, when we have an opportunity to engage with your work. So thank you so much for sharing that. And it was amazing to hear the bird song of Cali behind you as you were presenting. That was so lovely. Thank you. And it's great also to be in a Rodeamos Embrace dialogue session. Andre, thank you for reminding us of the values of the session. And I think, I don't know, it's just always great to start a session with that reminder and to carry on in that spirit of dialogue with our comments and discussion as we engage with Diego and his work. So as I was listening to this presentation and thinking of how privileged I am to have read the thesis in full, I just wanted to encourage everyone to do that and to engage with the work, because what Diego didn't have time, fair enough, to do with this presentation was to share the kind of methodological and ethical commitments that underpin his work and the rich ethnographic data, stories, and lives of the young people that have generated with him the findings that he's shared. And I think it's I just wanted to pay testament to that element of his work as well, which is hugely impressive. And I know he continues to be engaged with the organizations and young people and communities that he worked with to generate these really important findings. So there's that other element of his work in the written work that's really beautiful. And I guess, I mean, there's so much, like you said, Gwen, there's so much to draw out and discuss. And I guess the couple of things that I wanted to open for us to discuss further were around, I think Diego's conceptualizations of violence are so important and so interesting for the field and research and education, peace and conflict generally, and then also for helping to understand peace building and transition challenges in Colombia, particularly, as he made so clear in the presentation. And I think the conceptualizations of little c, big C conflict and little c, big C peace are really, really important, as well as situating young people's lives within these geographies of violence and peace and exploring how they make meaning and how schooling is part of creating those geographies, maintaining those geographies, reproducing violence and injustice, as well as sometimes challenging it. I was at a wonderful talk yesterday by Arathi Sriprakash, who's a colleague here in Bristol, about education and racial capitalism. And she was really holding in tension, but presence, the ways that education is both a site of violence and a site of hope, and how that happens within the same classroom and within the same school and community. And that's something that's also really present in Diego's work, I think, and well theorized in his work, and a useful premise for us to start to think about possibilities and pedagogies for peace building, as Diego does with the really rich proposal that he makes around peace building pedagogies at the end of this proposal. So what else? I'm just looking, I made a few notes. Yeah, I think it is really important to remember how peace building efforts often ignore or sort of skirt around those everyday and slow forms of violence that are so present in the lives of the young people that Diego describes in his work, and to try to connect those forms of violence with and see the ways in which armed conflict can spring from and can reinforce and amplify forms of everyday violence as well, I think is really important for educationalists and also for transitional processes. And I know the Truth Commission is trying to do that a bit, particularly in its focus on gender and sexualities within its work, its focus on ethnic diversity. So there are ways, I think, in which the transitional justice process in Colombia is perhaps grappling with those everyday forms of violence a bit more than other processes, maybe. So Diego, that will be interesting if you want to reflect on that and whether that's a false impression that I have. That's a question. And I guess, I guess it's a policy. Gwen's asked to reflect on policy issues. So I guess there is that big policy question around how to not turn a blind eye to everyday forms of violence and how to connect and try to unpick their relations with structural forms of oppression and violence as well. And then the other thing that I really wanted to raise for us to think about, Diego talked about empathy and about possibilities for peace education and pedagogies and relationships. I think relationships between teachers and students and relationships within classrooms for building empathy and for making space for emotion and space for hope, that point that Arathi's work was raising around education, holding that space for hope and tension with its violent relations and possibilities. And I wonder, I think it's interesting to me thinking about educational research to see how our critiques of neoliberalism and accountability and sort of failed decentralization or uncertain decentralization, which Diego's work also describes really well, I think, as he presents the sort of unnourishing sancocho option that decentralized education policy can generate. A lot of our critiques of education and its failed promises don't really acknowledge that the failed relationalities of education are the increasingly failed spaces for relationships to be rich and to make space for emotion and affect and dialogue, like Rodemos is trying to do here today. And I think Gwen deals with this in her work as well. So yeah, I wonder if that's an area for more sort of critical engagement in terms of the ways that we look at the failed promises of education. I think that's possibly another of the intergenerational challenges that you're grappling with in your work, Diego, as well as democracy and peace. Also the promise that education will lead to and generate futures for young people, which that last graph that you showed in Cali with the number of the huge proportion of young people in certain sectors of the city who are working in informal economies and who aren't accessing the promises that massified education has made for them, right? So there's another intergenerational challenge to grapple with. And then this is a question, and I'll close my comments with this question and look forward to hearing from others. You did your fieldwork obviously in schools and with young people prior to COVID-19, yeah? And these young people have, before the current strikes, have been without relational physical classrooms for, I think it's 15 months now, yeah? 8.4 million children in Colombia. I think I saw Arturo Charia, my colleague, was posting about this today, and the interesting campaigns around the importance of presential education, face-to-face education, as stadiums are reopening and things in Colombia with no prospect of schools reopening, as I understand, and you can correct and expand on the situation, obviously, with your greater knowledge. But I wonder about that lack of relation and lack of opportunity to be with peers and to be with educators, and how and if you see that as part of what's bringing young people onto the streets or into other forms of violence, as you highlighted today. Yeah. So let me close my comments there, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from others. I know there's many here who have a lot of expertise and knowledge to share on these topics.
Thank you so much, Julia. That's fantastic to have your reflections and questions. Diego, I'm gonna ask you to hold on to the answers that you want to give to Julia, and we'll first of all open up for maybe 2 questions, and then we'll go back to you and see if we can get this dialogue going. So anyone who would like to ask a question, please raise their hand using the hand function, or say type me or something in the chat, and I will be happy to invite you to ask your question. I can see Andre's already got his hand up, so I'll invite Andre to speak.
Thank you, Diego. Amazing presentation, and thank you, Julia. As usual, yeah, really good questions. I guess I and I have to apologize because very soon I will have to leave and I won't be able to stay until the end. But I just wanted to take this opportunity also to ask a couple of questions, and one that starts from the last comment that Julia made, but I want to take it in a different direction, and is, what is the challenge of doing these pedagogies that you are talking in a digital age? Because I feel that we have all these echo chambers that youth are very embedded in. And I remember when I was teaching at the Instituto Alberto Merani, talking to Juliana and saying, we need to start thinking about how we teach with WhatsApp and how we teach with Twitter. And, we cannot ignore those sort of things there, but what is the impact and what are the challenges and opportunities and how that needs to be taken into a broader conversation, probably with policymakers and also practitioners to think about these sort of things. And then the second question that I wanted to ask you has to do, and probably is related with these two, and is, but connected to emotions. And one of the work that we have been doing recently, or I've been participating on, is on drawing comics and doing animations to try to translate conflict topics into a more simple language that transform the emotions of people. And sometimes we have felt that this could be useful in the classroom. Do you think that this is something that could be used or has been used in these schools in order to try to, to talk about the peace process or the complexity of the Truth Commission or the complexity of the HEP by using some of these cartoons or animations that can help students to feel differently rather than just think differently? I guess those two questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Andre. And Jan, I see, has got a hand up. Before I hand over to Jan, I just want to make sure Diego is aware that you've had at least 3 very enthusiastic comments from people in the chat who are not asking questions, but just saying thank you to you and to Julia for a really rich conversation, and that they are looking forward to seeing the work published and referencing it. So please hurry up and get it published, and that's from Becky, Garnet, and Vidar. All thank you very much for your comments to Diego and Julia. Jan.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Buenos días. Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation and for the organizing this event. I have I have many comments like the others, but I try to make two questions very concrete. The first one has to do with the position of this peace building pedagogies within the schools in relation to other subjects and other courses that are being taught. So I would be curious, how are they seen by the staff, by the teachers in relation to the others? Because I'm just thinking similar efforts since 1990s, for example, to teach about racism or diversity would be kind of left to this kind of very, how to say it, Día de Diversidad or Days of Diversity, and this would be the kind of dedication, but but they wouldn't teach about structural racism, how this. And also it was seen like as very kind of different from what we really teach, like as a kind of the mainstream. Most of the subjects. So I was curious how the teachers who are teaching or or who are deploying these pedagogies, how are they seen and how they themselves see these efforts in relation to the other things that they are teaching. That's the first what I would be curious. And the second one, which relates to the question of temporalities, which I really like the idea, but I would like to ask you, what is the relation, like when you talk to the youth and you follow them and you talk to them, to what extent do they incorporate any of these pedagogies in their everyday lives? Or do they incorporate it, or they resist it? Or they say, well, this is something we teach in the school, but it has nothing to do with my everyday life. Because when you talk to the temporalities in the two localities that you selected, I don't know to what extent things have changed during all these years that that you follow this period. There is of course this peacemaking and agreement, but in terms of everyday life, everyday violence, so this continuum that are in this barrio in Cali and in Tumaco, well, I think we see very little change in terms of so for these people who live there, for these youth. For the schools, I don't know if there's any transformation of the schools. I think the everyday life hasn't been really changed. So to what extent do they respond to here, oh, well, here we are peace building, here we are like all these things that perhaps some teachers are trying to engage, and their everyday life in which very little has changed. So in a sense, in some other studies, they would say the youngsters, they would say, this is not our peace. What are you talking like? Eso no es nuestro paz. O sea, what type of peace you are talking about, since in our everyday life it's the same in a way. But I don't know if and I'm not an expert. I know you've done this long-term fieldwork, so I'd be curious if you have some thoughts on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jan. And if I might just shoehorn into Jan's question about the teachers' perceptions, what about risk to teachers? Because I know that teachers teaching about the peace process in some regions of the country during the peace process were not, very welcomed by some members of the community, and it could be very risky business doing peace pedagogies. Diego, you've got a lot there. Please feel free to pick and choose and build a thread as you see fit to try to answer some of the questions, but don't feel pressured to answer all of them. And we'll also give Julia the opportunity to bring if she's got any reflections also afterwards.
Thank you, Gwen, and thanks everybody for the nice comments and encouragement. I'm very happy about it. A lot of pressure, but hopefully I will respond at some point. And the questions, I see like a thread that I feel like it's very important that's at the center of the discussion, which is about everydayness. Like peace and conflict sounds always like it has to be the spectacular, it has to be the headliner, like it has to be war, it has to be. But when we try to bring it down about like how this is the experience in the lives of people and how maybe we can, relate to that if we want to move towards some kind of peace, then we realize the everydayness is like crucial. And I know when that you also probably think that in terms of what were the pedagogies of peace from the state, in terms of the peace process, like, there was the disconnection with the everydayness that was hard to overcome. And that many pedagogists tried to do that afterwards, not the state pedagogists, but other civil organizations tried to do that. So I feel like that thread is like throughout the questions, and I feel that what the explosion today in Cali is about, the unrest with the everyday. It's like we cannot bear this way of life anymore, right? So it's like it was there, but we didn't have like the messages we were sending, the pedagogies we were using, were not talking about that kind of unrest that was differently felt, although very similar, like a shared vulnerability, but differently felt between rural and urban populations. So in rural populations, like the environment of war creates that malaise, like that feeling of like unrest in a different way, which I feel, and I haven't studied like in depth the types of silencing and the types of like constraints in rural spaces, but in urban spaces, which was where I was, I feel it was there. It was like this skepticism, this alienation from the discourses of peace had to do with that. And so how to reach to that, I feel what Julia is asking in terms of emotions and relationships and how is this affected, and how, if COVID-19 had to do something with this, I pretty much like, I feel it's very close to that. Like, anyway, like if you are there and there is a lot of questions for young people who don't go to school. I mean, always school is a better option in terms of their own lives, for themselves and for anything. Like if the school wasn't there, I think the situation would be worse. That's what you realize when you're in the field, right? Like when you are in Tumaco, when you're there and you think, as Jan was saying, it seems like the school is not making any difference. But in terms of relationships and emotions, it helps a lot. In two topics that I feel that are very, very important for young people at those ages, which are, as I said, sense of belonging and prospects of future, belonging to a community or a group or something, being part of something is so important. And I feel that this is the kind of emotions that the schools sometimes alienate because of the curriculum, because of the ways in which the curriculum teaches about identity and citizenship, that doesn't speak to this everyday culture that Jan was mentioned. Like, how does this relate to my everydayness? So that would be one thing in terms of those emotions. But then also there is the question of what emotions are we talking about? What in this pedagogy, what emotions are we engaging with? Because actually in the educational discourses, there is a lot of talk about emotions in the last decade probably. But how and what are we dealing with these emotions? So I feel that let's say resilience, care, words like that, they are used a lot by teachers. But what do they actually mean by that? Well, how are these emotions practiced in the school? So teachers, and I try to reflect that in my writing all the time, like how teachers are so caring, like they care so much for their students. But that doesn't mean that helps them navigate the lives they are living outside. It's like, I care a lot for you, but I'm not giving you tools to anyway navigate outside. I just feel bad. I hope, I try, I tell you these things, but so I think when I talk about conflict analysis, it's also about the emotions involved in conflict analysis. What are the ways in which you take like very strong positions and that's an emotion, or how do you feel about like an unrest or anger, not in terms of anger management, but in terms of what that anger means in terms of injustice, for instance. So I think it'll have to be a question about, and I'm very, very interested in this topic, like what emotions are we talking about and how are we dealing with these emotions? And in terms of relationships, I think that the problem is that if the school doesn't offer this sense of belonging and prospects for the future, then there are many other, students will find that in many other places, which is fine also, but the school should be able to talk to that. So in Cali, in the school in Cali, it was so obvious that the relevance of football identities was much more than football identities. Like, it was much more than Cali in America. It was much more than that. It was the everydayness of whether I am part of one of them or I'm not one of them. which is what I try to say in terms of the distinction between respectable and disposable citizens. So students who go to school try to distance themselves from these footballing supporters who are like the disposable, because they will be always outside of school or on the verge of being taken away from school. And I don't want to, like, you know, I mentioned this to teachers many times, like there should be more talk about this in the school. There should be more activities about this in the school, and they themselves told me this is so important in our lives, in the lives of the school, but that never made it into the curriculum, right? So it's like we all recognize this is important, but this is not something we actually discuss. So I think that would tie to the practices maybe Andre was mentioning, like how do we bring this into the school, how we can make it into the curriculum, and maybe some activities helping to that. I think there is a lot of, and I don't want to give the impression of the opposite. There are lots of creative and innovative practices in Colombia. I mean, there are amazing teachers, amazing organizations. I just feel this is not generalized. It's just sporadic because of the educational system and the curriculum design. But there are many that yeah, I think students enjoy so much theater, and the ways in which theater allows to for them to express the emotions that they're actually feeling. You know, if they themselves can translate into a performance the emotions that brings them. So one of the pictures that I use is about a theater performance they decided to do, and they were talking about the groups, what they call the groups in all these places. People familiar with Colombia know that the groups mean like a group that controls the neighborhood, that probably controls youth recruitment. And so in that, they showed a lot of emotions that had to do with that, like fear, but also regret, but also inclusion, exclusion, like why my friend is going into the group. So I feel that those performances help like travel through that. And I also think that probably cartoons, animations help reaching that everydayness, but still I feel we have to combine. I always think that we still have to combine this emotional work with some kind of analysis of where this is happening and where this is going, because otherwise, to come back to the point Jan was making about temporalities, because otherwise temporalities mean nothing. I think one issue that I find very complex, and I don't think it's special to schools, but it's like the living in the present, you know, that sensation of living always in the present. That if there is no future, which is what normally people talk about with these young people, you know, and for the last 30 or 40 years, this is not new. The answers of the future has been in educational discourses in Colombia for many years. But I also think there is, and I talk about absence of the past. I mean, like, you know, you don't have a connection that brings that sense of belonging. So I think that those temporalities about, like, one thing that we have to disrupt, and Jan said very well, is like schools cannot be like these atemporal, you know, institutions that don't have a history themselves or that are placing history. So yeah, challenging that everydayness of like everything is the same is very important for these young people. Like, because if they feel everything is the same, nothing's gonna change, then you are so skeptical about any change. Like, nothing is gonna change. Everything is gonna always stay the same. Challenging that is I think the challenge of temporality, and teachers struggle a lot to be able to incorporate that. And in that, I think we have to acknowledge that schools, I think who said that schools are very stubborn institutions, are very hard to change from the inside, are very hard to move in their traditions, but also there are lots of pressures that teachers face to teach in certain topics and certain things. So when in the examples I gave, we were working with the Casa de la Memoria, we had these pedagogies, but the first question we asked teachers in those workshops was, where is this going? Where are you going to do this? Like, in one moment in your school, in your class, in your curriculum, where do you place it? In a way, the Colombian school curriculum is so broad that it allows to do these kind of things, but I think a teacher alone, it's probably will get tired. You need a larger project within the school, or a couple, like 3 or 4 teachers, and everything is possible from then on. I'll just leave it there, but there's lots I could say.
Amazing, Diego. Thank you. Julia, do you want to jump in on any of this?
I'm torn because I also want to hear more questions, and I know but maybe just really briefly, Gwen, on the question that you asked about threats to teachers, and which are very real in Colombia, right? Like teachers are threatened and worse. So yeah, I think this was several years ago now, but I was in Bogota at a workshop that was hosted by the National Center for Historical Memory prior to its current changes. But that was when they had the pedagogies of memory work going on, led by Maria Emma Wills, and they had a network of teachers who were using the historical memory approaches that center developed to teach about violent conflict in their classrooms. And they had a meeting of teachers within that network. I think there are about 300, maybe more, teachers who traveled to Bogota for this meeting. And yeah, it was an amazing meeting to be at. But one of the things that we did just a short questionnaire with teachers, where one of the questions was, do you feel safe doing this teaching? They were all teachers who were actively doing the teaching, and I don't have the data like right with me, but it was a large majority of teachers who answered no to that question, despite the fact that they're doing it. So this, I think, is a really important part of the culture of peace education policies that Diego describes, and of teachers in Colombia, and the commitment that they have, the care that they have for their students, and the commitment that not all, of course, but many teachers have to raising these topics, despite the curricular challenges and the resource challenges and the personal challenges to their safety. So that is an important and incredible piece of data, I think, from those teachers.
Yeah, I remember being in schools in the run-up to the referendum in 2016, and some teachers really trying to make space to talk with their students about the peace accords, but really feeling under a lot of pressure to do so, and really feeling highly unprepared to do so. I think that was the other thing, that many teachers said that they didn't feel, because it was such a controversial issue in the public eye, they felt inadequately equipped to share with their students and be confident that they knew what they were talking about, which is why they sort of tended to recur to the kind of cookie cutter model of the small CP stuff, right? And I found this extraordinary. I called it the internal peace narrative, which was not just used in schools, right? It was used across the board. Social organizations used it also. I called it the peace as maripositas y florecitas narrative, which completely delinked the idea of peace and peace building from the important cultural, local, individual level from the huge structural political process that was going on in the country, which was precisely the point of having the whole discussion in the first place anyway. And I know I can see that that's sort of resonating for some people, but I don't want to I have so many questions I could ask, but I know that we have more questions, and so please do raise hands, those who've got more questions. But I can see that we've had people write in the chat. Larissa, I think, was also interested to hear about the experiences of the teachers in creating and teaching the Cátedra de Paz. I don't know, Larissa, if you feel that your question has now been answered by that. Larissa is doing a PhD at the moment, Diego, on a similar topic on peace education. And perhaps I can just ask quickly, is your PhD thesis publicly available in an institutional repository, or is it embargoed? Can people read it? Or can we maybe find ways of sharing it with interested parties?
It will be available. I'm not graduated, but it will be in the library. I didn't place an embargo on it, so it will be.
Fantastic. So Larissa, that's one for your reading list.
And I'm happy to share it.
Fantastic. Yeah, it would be great for you guys to talk. Garnet is asking about the connection between the peace process and the transitional justice process and the current protests with regard to the perspectives of youth. Garnet, I don't know if you'd like to ask a more specific question, or just see if Diego will respond broadly to that.
Yeah. Hi, Diego. it briefly in the presentation and the connection. I just wanted to hear more about your thoughts about sort of how the youth are engaging with the transitional justice discussions or discourse around the peace process, and sort of how that's informing what's happening, or just, yeah, you mentioned it briefly. I just want to hear more about that. Thanks.
Fantastic, got it. Okay, thank you. And then we have a comment from Vidar. I don't know if Vidar, you would like to make your comment in person, because it seems like a really interesting one. I say in person, you know what I mean, with voice. Otherwise, okay, I'll just read it aloud so we can all hear it. He's saying, what you're saying about emotions really resonates. Much of the focus on SEL programming that much of the global education industry is peddling in delinks the personal from the structural and places responsibility on individual emotional management without getting into the nuts and bolts of the structural inequities that perpetuate certain kinds of emotions. Then Lina is asking a question about the role of Barras Bravas. Lina, would you like to say hi and ask a question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. No, I would like, because I have had conversations with Diego about this, and I know he has very interesting points about that. Like, what's the role of Barras Bravas, so this like football or soccer fans and groups arranged around football? What has been the role of them today, and why is that important that they remain absent in the discussions in the school, and how they don't belong to the school curriculum, or the conversations happening between teachers and students?
Thank you, Lina. We have a comment from Beatriz Bejarano saying the pressure from above is immense not to bring these topics into the classroom. The risk of being fired, which is also kind of violence. Many teachers feel afraid. Beatriz is a member of our Rodemos de Diálogo Peace Pedagogy team, which is currently working on a project with the Truth Commission to create a laboratory of teachers around the country who can create their own tools and share tools, share the resources with each other of doing pedagogy around truth and the Truth Commission. Beatriz, I don't know if you want to ask or make your comment yourself and say hello.
Yes, good morning from Bogota. Yes, you described the project very well. We have had in the past 2 sessions an incredible amount of emotions. Diego, you were talking about emotions, how important that is. The sessions are very well structured to construct together these tools that will in future help the Truth Commission express the legacy that they want to leave to the country through the teachers in the regions. And what we've seen in the last 2 sessions is that the teachers are immensely concerned about their safety, their well-being, their future, their ability to earn money, and that is taking such space that we had to kind of weigh what was more important, that they express these very, very deep, profound feelings, or that we continue as if nothing were happening outside with the construction of these tools. We decided on the first, and we've had to change the sessions and let people talk. And we're talking about between 80 and 100 teachers from all over the country, and some from outside of the country. There are people from Canada who are participating, people from Brussels, yes, one Belgian person. So it's not only Colombia, but of course, overwhelmingly, there are Colombians from rural areas as well, where they feel a sense of duty, a sense of wanting to guide their students in the right way in this particular moment, but they feel overwhelmed and very much afraid for their physical safety and for their relevancy to help their students at this point. So it's had a tremendous impact, all that we are living right now in the country. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Beatriz. Wonderful to hear from you. Becky, and I think this will be the last question.
Hi, everyone. I'm Becky. This is little Antonio. We're navigating childcare and watching Diego's presentation right now. I just had a question, Diego. Thanks for the great presentation. Every time I hear your work, I get more excited about it. I had a question about I'm curious, who the youth think of as the enemy. Who's the enemy? Who's the person that is making their life precarious? People or person or institutions. And do moments like this where you have the state violently repressing people, are they moments where youth's understanding of who the enemy is shifting? And then there was somewhat of a critique, I think, of formación política and the traditional social movements and the relationship or disregard of youth's own political formation. Was that a critique of those traditional social movements, or what's the relation? How should youth be relating to more traditional social movements, and what's the role of political formation? So I know you can take on any parts of those questions. So thanks, great presentation, good to see you.
Thank you, Becky. And I'm also interested to hear more about the critique to falta formación política. I think it's a really interesting narrative to hear circulating now. So it would be good to hear what you think about that. And I'll hand back to you. Perhaps I'll toss the ball to Julia first to see if she'd like to make any comments on some of the discussion, and then hand over to you, Diego, to wrap up. But I want to shoehorn my own question in as well. And I guess that there's two. One of them is, can the Cátedra de Paz be saved? Is there anything worth rescuing from there? And if so, how? And then the other question is, what can international academics do to help in terms of whether that's lobbying the government for better content for the Cátedra de Paz, or whether it's providing materials to schools, or and perhaps Julia has some thoughts on this as well. It'd be really nice to know how kind of networks of international academics can support these efforts and enrich these efforts in Colombia. So Julia, perhaps over to you first.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting it to come to me first. I'm like, oh. I guess the Cátedra de Paz, can it be saved question. I wonder also, this isn't an answer, it's just even more complicating the question to then throw it to Diego. How did the discussions around history and reinvigorating or reintroducing history as a taught subject in Colombia interact and integrate with can the Cátedra de Paz question be saved, and what will happen, and what, Diego, do you think would be an ideal outcome from those ongoing discussions around history and historical narrative and its role in curricula and teaching in Colombia? The Cátedra de Paz it's another, there's so many things that when you read them in Colombia and Colombian education policy and transitional justice policy sounds so great, right? And the Cátedra is, I guess, not entirely one of those because the optional nature of it. But yeah, like Nodis is working on the Cátedra de Paz, there's lots to talk about. So let's add that history question, and then and I really want to leave time to hear Diego's answer to Becky's questions as well. Those were great questions. So let me really briefly say, what can international academics do? Publish Diego's book and share it as widely as we can. And I think, in the UK, there's a very clear role for us to be as engaged and involved as possible in all of the anti-overseas development assistance cuts that are currently occurring that affect research, but also aid to urgent situations. So I think that's a really key priority for us all to not let that fall off of our agendas. It's unfortunate that that is part of our agenda suddenly, because you would have hoped that commitment would have remained one. So those are sort of two small things, but I think there's also, opening possibilities for dialogue and amplifying and sharing the amazing work of Diego and his colleagues is really important. So let's go back to Diego.
Thank you, that's great. Diego.
The difficult question, second round, always the part talks. I'll just start by talking a little bit about the transitional justice question, which I feel is, I don't know, I feel like we've been in these stages. First, we talked a lot about democracy, which was like the transitions to democracy. My mom tells me about this. She's a teacher too, right? So she said, oh yeah, that was trendy. And then after it was peace, and then, no, well, after it was memory, and then after it was like peace, and now it's transitional justice. And I think there are like all those layers add up to a very important narrative that we need to embrace and like make it like a cultural part of the school, right? Like what I would say is that it's not that all these laws and curriculum mandates are useless. It's just that they are just so dispersed. You know, they're just there to tick the box of the demand of the moment, of the political moment, but there is no political will behind them, right? Because when the state, not the government, has decided to put political will after programs, they have done it. They've been actually successful within the schools. Like convivencia is so prevalent. There's been a lot of money on that, and a lot of like push to incorporate it somehow. So, or let's say the national test, you know, language and maths, like they push a lot into that because of the OECD. So when there's will, there can be, but like if you just put it there to tick the box, and I feel the political development of the Cátedra de la Paz really shows that, like, you just do it and you're not really committed to it. So that will not happen. But coming back to the transitional justice question and the youth now, so one danger we have is to add one more topic into that layer and not connecting it to the other layers. So not connecting it to citizenship, peace, and memory in a way that actually speaks to, let's talk about what the problem is in terms of conflict analysis in the country. So if it only becomes another layer, it will probably slip through the fingers of the curriculum or become a specific initiative from a specific teachers, which is always the concern, or probably the outcome in this kind of system. Now, something that I feel very interesting in what is happening right now in Cali is that one of the main barriers to a solution to this problem is the enormous concern that young people in the points, in the blockades, have for what's going to happen to them, right? So there'll be justice on them. And that justice could be like social cleansing, or like legal prosecution, penal prosecution, right? And I feel it's interesting that they are kind of using the words of transitional justice to say we need some kind of esclarecimiento and like alternative justice, restorative justice, right? Like, and we're not like, of course, that's clear, and I understand that's the main concern. What's going to happen to us? So I feel like that having that discourse available is very interesting. How they are taking that up as one of the first points to move forward, mainly to protect themselves from either being killed or being sent to jail, but also because it's something that is there that it could be an alternative to move forward with dialogues. But it's a difficult one to accept for the government and for many people in Colombia that really, really always want punishment as a solution, right? So I feel that pedagogically speaking, it's another instance in which we need to learn in Colombia to talk about justice beyond punishment, like to talk about justice in many dimensions of justice: social justice, transitional justice, restorative justice, and see that in practice and how that can help. And then now coming back to the question of Cátedra de la Paz, can it be safe? Well, I just said, like, the political will is the most important thing, and then how we support and prepare teachers to talk about, teachers and the society more in general, to talk about controversial issues and difficult issues. Like, you don't have to have all the answers, but you have to have some kind of practice in how to talk about controversial issues, but also and different difficult issues. So there are issues that are difficult because they are emotionally difficult, like, for instance, sexual violence. And there are controversial issues just because we have different opinions. So there is the question we have for teachers also is that if you don't do that, then somebody else is doing it, right? Either TV, families. But I mean, I was very worried that in the schools, who was doing that? The police. The police was giving talks on drug consumption, like as if they were teachers that had like, if this is such a prevalent problem that even young people recognize as a problem, how we talk about these things? And I think that practicing that is not impossible. I don't think it's something that schools teachers cannot do in their classrooms. It's just that they need more practice on that, right? Like, and seeing how that could be done, and like, and also, and I think they aware, understand the risks of not having that. So I think that the whole discussion about the new curriculum for me is so important, because these are always the ways in which in Colombia we avoid the elephant in the room, and we avoid discussing the root of these problems. So we tend to move into the prevention of violence. Don't consume drugs, but let's not talk about the actual problem. In Tumaco, it's crazy, because in Tumaco the drug problem is life. You know, coca is life in Tumaco. It's the whole economy. It's everything. So that has not been discussed in the school is so strange. But also in Cali, in the everyday, it was a concern for students. So yeah, I would say that. But so far, I think there are then two actions that you could do as a scholar that I try to do, and I don't think it's a good answer, but provide support to teachers, definitely create materials that help these practices in terms of, because in Colombia there are no official textbooks, so a lot of teachers struggle a lot, like to know how to do these things or have sources from which to do that, and when they feel unprepared, that doesn't help. And I think create networks of teachers also helps, because more support means less risk, like feeling safer, let's say. But overall, I mean, we need a political debate on including this in the political education curriculum. Like, you know, we're just avoiding it. Like, this is the normalization of violence and the avoidance of violence is structural in the curriculum. It's just how many words we can use to avoid this topic and not actually engage with it, right? So the last point is Becky's questions about who is the enemy about formación política, and I'll chime in that with the Barras Bravas question, because you feel like, okay, you know, local support groups, young people who belong to football supporters, what do we make of them? But in the last few years, they become very, very politicized, very organized. And in fact, many question the use of barras bravas, and which is like, I don't know how to translate that, anger footballers for social barras. You know, like they have community work, political work, but they also been very involved in all the mobilizations in many ways. It's just I don't think society has realized how much and how important they are for this. So I feel there are a lot of formación política in that, both in those in the barras and those who, and there is so many interesting issues there. Like, they are not like, if we think like, who you think is the enemy? What youth? Because they are so diverse, right? So in the barras there are many, like the diversity in the barras is so amazing. Like, you have people from private universities, stratos altos, as we say in Colombia, high class, low class, middle class. It's such an encounter that we don't have anywhere else in Colombian society that is so apartheid-like, you know. And they meet there, and that becomes so. I think that what tells us about it, like, we need more of that. We need more of that actually provides this sense of belonging and kind of awareness of politics, and at least a space to discuss it. But there are not that many. The school is not providing them. So, but we need to be aware that the youth who are more like, most of the mobilizations are made up of youth, but not all the youth are mobilized, and we need to be very aware of that, because I mean, it feels like all young people are pro paro, pro movement, but I'm sure 50% of them are not saying it and are against and are like pretty much like in agreement with this gente de bien and respectable citizens, because that's part also of how they understand their place in society. So I feel when it's not a criticism of social movements. I'm just very interested in the idea that people mention that. Like, we have a problem to solve this problem with youth because they lack formación política, because they lack this we don't know how to deal. They don't believe in like a negotiation table. They don't believe in what you call that, un pliego de peticiones. They don't because they have never done it. They have never been in this kind of processes. So how do we deal with these people who have not that training, let's say, that formación, right? And so that concern for me, like, why is this happening? What happened to unions? What happened to youth cultural movement? What happened to schools? What happened to universities that nobody has ever provided or reached to them that they actually have that practices? But they take it from other places, which is fine. So I think that's a very interesting question. And then, I just say I don't think there is one enemy, because youth are not like there's youth against the world. There are many youth who have many enemies depending on where they are placed in society, and some of them could be Castro-Chavismo, and for some of them it could be right-wing paramilitarism, right? Like, I wouldn't say like there's just one. I feel that surveys really tell us that what we have lost is like capability to like build with them society, because they distrust everything and everyone. They just have like in Cali at least, in terms of institutions, they just trust like the church, and thank God the church have been there or was there, because otherwise it would have been great. Like, we knew this was going to happen, and if it wasn't for like the presence of and the trust these young people had in the church, it could have been even worse, and it could have been like even worse, like the civil war or something, like in terms of the amount of dead people, So the church and universities, but universities, not even the public universities, I say, have this kind of reach to these young people. We're so far apart in the city, so specialized. Like, we mean like something that is respectable but unreachable, right? So it's like we mean nothing to them really, which is very sad. But like, it talks about like a huge hole in this formación política that we don't have. I mean, I don't know. I think it's an interesting point.
Amazing, Diego. Thank you so much for all of your engagement with these questions. I'd like to wrap up with just maybe 4 points, or sort of not really conclusions, but comments that I think sort of draw some of these things together. The first thing I think is that in Colombia, and I'm sure more widely, education is often framed as a solution to the problems of society. And I think it was really interesting to see how much the negotiations in Havana included kind of education drops, kind of like, this bit, okay, we can see that there's going to be a problem with in political participation, the stigmatization. So we have to unroll, a kind of campaign against stigmatization. Education, not just in schools, but also, kind of more broadly in kind of public awareness educational campaigns. But often the kind of analyses, I think, of the peace negotiations came down to, well, this is a cultural problem. Oh, well, so we can put a module about it in schools and thereby we'll fix it. And so I was really intrigued, Diego, to hear you say that you were the generation of when it was democracia. And of course, like after the 91 Constitution, the democracy ideal, but also, classes, cátedras like civic education. I mean, in England, we never had any of these kinds of things, right? So it's a kind of very Colombian thing to put kind of political problems into little packages that can maybe be solved by teaching kids to do things differently, but kind of never end up working. And peace is obviously the latest one of these. And the second thing I'd like to say is I really appreciated Julia's quotation of someone whose name I now don't recall, that education as both a site of violence and hope. And I think that's really been very present in the presentation that you've shown us, Diego, and we can see just as much, we can see much of both. And I think the third thing related to that is that clearly schools can help reframe complex political issues, despite the kind of the problem of the dropping in a bit of education here and there as a kind of glib attempt to solve structural problems by handing the problem over to teachers, there is a capacity that teachers do have to help young people reframe these big issues, and that we need to help them do that in all the ways we can. And the fourth and final comment is really that I think we've really seen very much in your presentation, Diego, the kind of the problem in Colombia of the depoliticization of peace, and specifically in peace education. And I think that this model that you built of the small CP and the big CP is really helpful to help us see how the way in which education has been handled at a political level doesn't help teachers to reframe political debates in such a way as that young people can see the connections between their local experiences of violence and need for peace building at a local level and the structural problems and the structural need for ending the conflict and building a peace at a kind of wider level. And I really liked your advocating for teaching conflict analysis. I think that's really, really important. And also your advocate of teaching the principle of reconciliation, understanding reconciliation as based in a recognition of the divisions within society and a recognition of that agonism that all societies have, because there is no such thing as a totally harmonious, non-conflictive society, but that those divisions are within us. Like, it's not that this outsider has come in and affected us, but that it's within us. And so we need to come to terms with that and recognize that in order to heal from it and move forward. So I really echo everyone who said that I look forward very much to the publication of this book, which I'm sure will be very important also to publish it in Colombia. And I'll just end by thanking Diego and Julia very much for being the guests on this wonderful discussion, and also thanking everyone for the participation in what has been now 8 seminar series, which have been incredibly rich and rewarding to chair. It's been a real privilege to be able to join scholars from different countries, different generations, working from different disciplines to try to think about and analyze and solve complex issues in peace and conflict in Colombia. All of the videos of the 8 seminars are online on the Rodemos de Diálogo YouTube channel, so you can all rewatch them in your own time. There is even one on football by Pete Watson on the role of football in the Santos government's peace process and peace initiatives, with comments from Matthew Brown, a colleague of Julia's at Bristol. And he does talk quite a bit about the barras bravas and the barras sociales, the attempt to reconfigure the space of football groups and football fan clubs as spaces for reconciliation. So I do take the opportunity to plug that one. And also to invite all of you to follow our other seminar series within the Embrace Dialogue Academia's work that Andre chairs called Critical Dialogues on Reconciliation, which goes beyond Colombia and draws together scholars working on reconciliation from different contexts, different countries and different disciplines, to think through what reconciliation might mean. And of course, in Rodemos de Diálogo, we're particularly interested in learning how those scholarly debates can inform the work that we do in Colombia. So without any more words from me, I would invite everyone to turn on their cameras and their microphones to give our fantastic panelists today a round of applause, and also to all of you for coming and spending this time here today with us and embracing the dialogue of Julia and Diego. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone, really, for your comments and questions.
Thanks so much for coming.
Julia.
Thank you,
Well, lovely
Diego.
to see
Thank
everyone.
You, Julia.
Thank you.